The first reviews for Mr. and Mrs. Smith Season 1 give it an impressive Rotten Tomatoes score, which reveals a harsh reality about the 2005 movie. Amazon's Mr. and Mrs. Smith series serves as a loose remake/reboot of the same-named hit movie starring Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie as John and Jane Smith, a married couple who turn out to be spies tasked with killing one another. The Amazon show flips this premise by revealing right off the bat that John and Jane are spies working for the same company, who must impersonate a married couple while gradually falling in love. As is often the case with remakes, Mr. and Mrs. Smith Season 1's announcement was initially met with skepticism, as the original movie maintains an iconic legacy due to the real-life relationship between its two stars. However, the Donald Glover and Maya Erskine starring Mr. and Mrs. Smith show excitingly proves itself superior in quality to critics, as Season 1 debuts to an impressive, fresh 89% score on Rotten Tomatoes. This happens to be a substantial improvement from the movie, which holds a 60% score from critics, and highlights the biggest flaws in the original Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Mr. and Mrs. Smith Season 1's great reviews prove the movie only worked because of Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie's chemistry. The reviews for the TV show are much better than the movie, and the critics' notes about the projects highlight the important reasons why. The Mr. and Mrs. Smith movie was often criticized for its script losing steam, having a lackluster story, and prioritizing launching into action scene after action scene. While it's hard to deny the movie's entertainment value, the most frequent notes of praise were for Jolie and Pitt's chemistry and action skills, which are noted as being stronger than the film couple's actual relationship and character building. Glover and Erskine certainly have compelling chemistry, but the TV show more impressively manages to improve upon the movie's story-based weaknesses in order to find a proper balance in its character building. More so than in the film, Mr. and Mrs. Smith Season 1 prioritizes its witty screenplay and story progression for John and Jane, with the action being relatively secondary. Mr. and Mrs. Smith doesn't work without Glover and Erskine having chemistry, but that isn't the primary reason why the well-rounded show succeeds, unlike Pitt and Jolie's movie. Mr. and Mrs. Smith Season 1's Rotten Tomatoes score proves its risky tone change paid off. Donald Glover as John and Maya Erskine as Jane in Mrs. and Mrs. Smith show. While the Mr. and Mrs. Smith movie is more of a satirical action comedy that feeds on its own extravagance, the TV show integrates far more drama, giving the two projects very different tones. Going from a more lighthearted spy action comedy to being a serious action comedy could have been a big risk for the TV show, but its great reviews prove that this change worked for its new format. However, while the action and spy missions primarily supplement the romantic drama and development in Mr. and Mrs. Smith Season 1, another season would likely mean elevated action scenes for its two leads.